Hello and welcome once again to this wonderful offering by neilib.com. We are dealing with the history topic number 10, which talks about authoritarian states, and in that we are doing the case study of Joseph Stalin in USSR. We have looked at Stalin's rise, we have looked at some of the key changes that he's bringing about in the USSR system, and now we are going to look at one of the final changes after collectivization that he brings about in the system called industrialization, and then we'll jump straight into the kind of methods that he's using to bring about this system, which are the question of purges. And in fact, perhaps in this video or in the next video, we'll start talking about one of those most horrendous of methods, which has been subsequently dubbed by historians as the Great Terror. So in this video, we'll focus on industrialization, and then in the next one, we'll talk about the Great Terror. So without any further ado, let's just jump straight into it. Stalin described his industrialization plans for the USSR as an attempt to establish a war economy. So this is in fact going back to the war communism, but in its extreme form. He declared that he was in fact making a war on the failings of Russia's past and on the class enemies within the nation. So this war has to be fought as a nation as a whole against what? Against the kind of very slow snail-like path that we've done in the earlier, and against all the enemies who are existing even now, and they need to be gotten rid of. He also claimed that he was preparing the USSR for a war against the capitalist enemies abroad. So that is also something, again, the same logic, enemies inside, enemies outside, all the time fighting against these two. This was not simply a martial imagery, so this is not only a warlike imagery. Stalin regarded iron, steel and oil as the sinews of war. So as the muscles of war, he thinks of oil and he thinks of steel and he thinks of iron and all of these things. You would of course remember that Stalin simply means a man of steel. Their successful production would guarantee the strength and readiness of the nation to face its enemies. So that is also something that is very important, that if we have all of this, it is something that can be really understood and that can be thought of as powerful ways and tools to fight the enemies. Once again, enemies both within and without. Soviet industrialization under Stalin took the form of a series of 5-year plans, or FYPs. A GOS plan was required by Stalin to draw a list of quotas of production ranging across the whole of Soviet industry. What is the GOS plan? GOS plan is simply the Soviet Agency of Economic Planning. So there's an economic planning agency that brings forward quotas which are to be completed as a part of the 5-year plan, both within the Soviet structure and also the overarching positionality. The process began in 1928, so the same year as he declares the war on capitalism and on colonization. And except for the years 41 to 45, which are the years of the Second World War, it lasted until Stalin's death in 1953. In all, there were 5 separate plans during this period of time. Number 1 is the plan between 28 and 32, then in 33 to 37, then 38 to 41, and 46 to 50, and finally 51 to 55. Now, if you notice already, you can see that most of these don't end in 5 years. In fact, they end quite sooner. So that was another way of spreading a certain kind of propaganda, that we are so powerful, we are so clever, we are so intelligent, and we are so hardworking as Soviet people that we in fact achieve what we have said we will do in 5 years. We in fact achieve those in way lesser time. It's a part of that entire propaganda series, and this is spread around as a part of the mechanism to show that Stalin's revolution is in fact far more successful and is in fact far more active in making the people happy and in making the people powerful. Now, amongst these, the first 5-year plan then between 1928 and 32. The term plan here is misleading. The first F5P in fact laid down what was to be achieved, but it did not say how it was to be done. So it was just laying out in terms of, goals, that this is what we want to achieve eventually, but how that will be done, what is the way of doing that, that is something that the plan did not speak much about. It simply assumed that the quotas would be met, that if we give the quotas to the people, if we give a certain number of things or tasks or numbers to be achieved to the people, it will automatically be done. And what the first FIP in fact represented, therefore, was a set of targets rather than a plan. So it had mostly targets and not so much a plan. As had happened with collectivization, local officials and managers falsified their production figures to give the impression that they had in fact met their targets, when in fact they had highly fallen short. So it was this entire creation, of figures which were always fudged, figures which were always created as a lie. Hannah Arendt, the great German philosopher thinker, she writes that, that if you think of a lie in terms of just as one thing in terms of the presence of the truth, it's like a tear in the fabric of reality. But what if you are able to create a lie that is something that is happening throughout? What if the lie creates a new fabric altogether? How do you tear that? So that is something that's happening here. All of this, like in terms of falsifying of the number of requisitions that have been met, or the level to which the quota has been achieved, all of that is completely falsified. How do you find out any fabric of reality in such hugely and crazily falsified numbers? For this reason, precise statistics of the first FYP are difficult to determine, because we don't know how much of it is a lie and how much of it is truth. A further complication is that three quite distinct versions of the first FYP eventually appeared. So different versions of the FYP also are appearing, because they're not very clear. It's the first time they're attempting it. So they keep producing different versions of the first 5-year plan, and that keeps changing, and those are all three are very distinct. Impressed by the apparent progress of the plan in its early stages, so clearly there's no way to reach this, but seeing all these falsified numbers and seeing all these things on paper, Stalin encouraged the formulation of an optimal plan, which in fact reassessed targets upwards. So a new plan was then created midway, which was in fact going to like reconsider all the figures, but this time upwards, like becoming even more ambitious, becoming even more unrealistic and improbable about all of these things. These new quotas were hopelessly unrealistic and stood no chance of being reached. Nonetheless, on the basis of the supposed achievements of the optimal plan, the figures were in fact revised still higher. Western analysts suggest that figures in source J are the closest approximation to real figures. So you can see between these numbers that these are the ones that are closest to real figure. The importance of these figures should not be exaggerated, however, because we know that statistics can speak whatever you want them to speak. They often hide much more than what they reveal. But at the time, it was the grand design, and the detail did not matter. The fact that they were able to achieve so much is something that they are ready to celebrate much more. The plan was a huge propaganda project which aimed at convincing the Soviet people that they were now, in fact, personally engaged in a very vast industrial enterprise. If you read the analogy and the metaphor that he's drawing for it, George Orwell, in his famous book Animal Farm, it's the same thing. The way the pigs, they ensure and they encourage all the animals to become a part of this entire grand measure. It is the same representation, the kind of vast exercises that they take place at that point of time. They are all representative of the kind of work that was being done in the Soviet Union as a part of the 5-year plan. Nor was it all a matter of state enforcement. Among the young, especially, there was an enthusiasm and a commitment that suggested that many Soviet citizens, in fact, believed that they were genuinely building a new and better world. So, quite a few of these new party members, who had enrolled much later after the Bolshevik Revolution, they were the generation that was living through this first. I mean, for them, this was the new revolution. They were very young to have remembered the Bolshevik Revolution. In fact, their parents or their grandparents' generation was in fact a part of that entire revolution, and that's why they thought that this was their chance to show to the world that Russia meant something, Soviet Union meant something, and it was something brand new, and it was an experiment that had never been done. So they were really moved by this level of confidence, and they were really moved by this level of new skill that they wanted to display to the rest of the world. To show how successful they were, officials often exaggerated the production figures. Nevertheless, the first FYP was an extraordinary achievement overall, and that's the final text to be taken away, that despite all the fudged figures, despite all the up and down that was being done in terms of statistics and numbers, there is no denial of the fact that overall the first FYP was an overarching success. And coal, iron, and generation of electricity all increased in huge proportions. The production of steel and chemicals was less impressive, while the output of finished textiles actually declined. So things that were not required in the name of modernity, things that were not the sinews, the muscles of the industrial output, those were ignored, such as textiles. Whereas things which were seen as a part of this, new industrial growth of the building of the country, of the contribution to the building of the country, all of that was in fact encouraged a lot, and those actually improved in terms of production. So how do the second and the third 5-year plans go, which are before the war? Although the second and third FYP were modeled on the pattern of the first, the targets set were much more realistic this time. Nevertheless, they still revealed the same lack of coordination that had characterized the first. Overproduction occurred in some parts of the economy and underproduction in others, which frequently led to whole branches of the industry being held up for the lack of vital supplies. Because everything is so closely connected, many a times the underproduction of something in fact meant that other things that had to be produced because of that. So for example, if iron was required somewhere else or steel was required somewhere else and it was being underproduced, then of course the dependent tertiary, secondary industries would also slow down in terms of production because the primary product was in fact being underproduced. As a result, there was hoarding of resources and a lack of cooperation between the various parts of the industrial system. So wherever there was surplus, people would hoard it and then later on would not cooperate with other sections of the same system in order to provide what would we have thought of, as help to each other in order to succeed in these planning measures. As a result, there was hoarding of complaints about poor standards, carefully veiled so as not to appear critical of Stalin or the plan, were frequent in fact. So there were complaints constantly of poor standards, even though they were not very direct against Stalin or against his entire this plan, etc. Nevertheless, there were complaints about the kind of measures that people were being made to go through. What successes there were occurred again in heavy industry, where the second FIP began to reap the benefit of the creation of large-scale plants under the first plan. So how does Stalin's industrial record stand out? The four key products, coal, steel, oil and electricity, provided the basis for the war economy, which enabled USSR not only to survive 4 years of German occupation, but eventually to win the great victory over Germany in May of 1945. So the fact that all of this had been invested in beforehand actually plays a role between 1941 and 1945. Had this not been there, perhaps Germany would have been able to defeat USSR in the Second World War. So all of that is in fact being shown very clearly towards this time. The other statistic that you can find in our Neil IB videos for paper 1, if you look at it, where we've done the German expansionism, there's an entire video that is dedicated to the kind of new money that Hitler was investing in German expansion, and the only country that by 1936 is competing with Hitler and in the year 1936 is in fact taking over Hitler is the Soviet Union under Stalin in terms of investment in war mechanism, all right, in expansion strategies and in weaponry, etc., in the arms mechanism. And all of that investment, of course, requires iron, steel, coal, etc. as well. So all of that is related, that entire drive of rearmament is related to this entire drive of industrial record as well. And it helps Stalin survive the onslaught of the Germans in the Second World War. So we can see that coal in terms of millions of tons from just 35 in 1927, in just 13 years, it goes on to 150 million tons, so 5 times in 15 years. Similarly, steel goes up 6 times, so 3 6 are 18. So 3 millions in 1927 and 18 in 1940. Oil similarly from 12 to 26, which is double. And electricity similarly 18 to 90, which is again multiple times over. And all of this is in millions. So this is extremely huge in terms of the record that he is producing and the kind of record that is existing for the Soviet Union. As I said, the true result of this, of course, while it will be felt during the lifetime of these people in these 13 years, will in fact be much more strongly felt during the Second World War between 1939 and 1945. But again, the war for Germany and Stalin only starts in 1941. So Stalin's industrial program succeeded in the area of heavy industry, which he was very clear was the heavy muscle, was the sinew of war effort. The building of large projects such as factories, bridges, refineries, canals was in fact a very impressive achievement. However, the Soviet economy itself remained unbalanced. Little attention was given to light engineering, which the advanced industrial nations were now successfully developing. So this is an unbalance, right? Because he's thinking that all the heavy industries are always of use. So all the focus is always on heavy industries. The light engineering, which is something that others are in fact investing in, skilled specialized activities such as precision and tool making, all of that is in fact being ignored as far as the Soviet Union is concerned. And Stalin's love for what he called the grand projects of communism meant too little attention was paid to producing quality goods that could then be profitably sold abroad. So that idea that if we invest in these lighter engineering things which can then be utilized abroad and then the capital can be raised which can be back again invested in our industry, that idea doesn't strike him at all. What he's selling is of course the peasant grains, etc., that he's more than ready to sell. But in terms of advancing technology of these lighter tools, he's not interested in that. He's more interested in the grand projects of communism, which of course go in line with his understanding of his second revolution, Stalinist revolution, as far as his country is concerned. So his revolution will be marked by this grand expansion of communism according to him. Stalin's schemes failed to raise the living standards of the Soviet workers. This is very clear that all these successes may have been for the nation, may have been in terms of production of coal, steel, oil and electricity, but when it comes to the life of the average worker, by the way, in whose name all of this is being done, please remember all of this is the proletarian revolution according to Marxist ideology and Marxist thinking. The center of this entire discussion should be the worker, the working class, the proletarian worker in the factory. His condition, however, remained dismal. all of this failed to raise the living condition of the Soviet worker. Indeed, such measures as direction of labor and the imposition of severe penalties for slacking means working lazily, and absenteeism created harsher conditions for the workforce. In 1941, when the German invasion effectively destroyed the third five-year plan, the living conditions of the Soviet industrial workers were lower at that point of time in 1941 than they were in 1928. So in fact, there's a 10-year, more than 10-year gap between what they were expected, the way they were expected to live, and the way they actually lived in terms of their dismal working conditions. So, of course, not all of this would have been met with any kind of, global or overarching acceptance. There must have been opposition to this. And in order to deal with this opposition, he comes up with the idea of purges. Purges is it's an old word. It's an old word in the sense that it's used in multiple contexts. Even Shakespearean dramas have this word. In Julius Caesar, which is a play by Shakespeare, when one of the characters blames, like Brutus, in fact, blames that why are we killing him and why are we thinking of planning to assassinate Julius Caesar, then one of the characters tells him that no, we are not butchering him and not slaughtering him. We are in fact purging our temple of democracy. We are in fact purging this entire Roman Empire and Roman Republic, etc. So in that sense, purge is simply means cleansing. All right. Here, it has a much more menacing meaning. Here, it of course has much more dangerous meaning. Painful meaning, horror struck meaning. But in its actual usage, purge simply means cleansing. Here, of course, it refers to the cleansing of human beings, removal of human beings. Having become the vozhd or the leader of the Soviet Union by 1929, which by the way is his 50th birthday, Stalin spent the rest of his life, the remaining portion of his life, consolidating and extending his authority then. The purges were his principal weapon of achieving this. So, liquidating the enemy, decimating the enemy, completely getting rid of the enemy, cleansing the enemy is his most utilized method of actually achieving this purge. They became the chief mechanism for removing anyone who he regarded as a threat to his authority. So, you would be purged if you were a threat to Stalin's authority in the Soviet Union. The Stalinist purges, which began in 1932, however, were not unprecedented. So he's not the first one to be starting them. And while the main onslaught of these purges, or the main number of these purges, are only happening after 1932, there are mechanisms and there are ways in which they have been done earlier, not only by Stalin himself, but even before by Lenin as well. Public show trials had been held during the early stages of the first five-year plan as a way of exposing saboteurs who were accused of damaging the USSR's industrial program. So, if you were a new peasant and you broke the system by mistake or you broke the mechanical system by mistake, you were automatically blamed of sabotaging the industrial system. And many a times, if you were, in fact, even if you were known to be a disruptive element or a rebelling element, your mistake would then be used to expose you to the rest of the world, and then you would be held and you would be kept on a show trial, and you would of course be then blamed for sabotaging the entire Soviet economy. At the beginning, party purges were generally not as violent as they later became. The usual procedure was to oblige members to hand in their party card for checking, at which point any suspect individuals would not have their cards returned to them. So simply your party membership would be taken away, and because your party membership is taken away, you cannot enjoy any privileges or any perks of the Soviet state, because please understand, the Soviet state perks and privileges are directly linked to your status in the party and to the way your party is going to deal with you. This clearly amounted to expulsion, since without cards, members were denied access to all party activities and all Soviet perks and privileges. Under such a system, it became progressively difficult to mount effective opposition, because if all the privileges are taken away from you, how do you question? How do you do anything that can really help you, to prove your point or to question Stalin's great authority? And despite the efforts that were made in the early 1930s to criticize Stalin, as the Ryutin affair in 1932 illustrates, and yet, although the Ryutinites had clearly failed, their attempted challenge convinced Stalin that organized resistance to him was still possible. So, this is an affair that happens 4 years into his complete power takeover, or 3 years into his complete takeover of power, that is from 1929, and still this affair happens. What is this affair? In 1932, so 3 years after his complete takeover of power, the followers of M. N. Ryutin, a right communist, so somebody who belonged to Tomsky and Bukharin school of thought, he published an attack on Stalin, describing him as an evil genius who had brought the revolution onto the verge of destruction because of all the horror that must have been unleashing because of the extreme left movement that Stalin did in the name of industrialization and collectivization. Ryutin, in fact, writes all of that. The Ryutinites, immediately, of course, you have to use a noun in order to, collectivize all these enemies and like get rid of them. The Rudenites were put in fact on public trial and then later on expelled from the party, and this treated for Stalin as a lesson that despite being in power for 3 years, he could still be challenged, and this kind of questioning could still be brought into effect. In analyzing Stalin's rule, historians generally accept that they are dealing with behavior that sometimes went beyond reason and logic. Stalin was deeply suspicious by nature and suffered from increasing paranoia as he grew older, as the letter below from his daughter Svetlana attests. Please understand, he did now it has been proved beyond doubt that he did have a case of medical paranoia. Clinical paranoia is something that he suffered from. Paranoia is simply a disease which makes you see enemies everywhere. Regardless of whether these people claim to be your friends, whether they have done something kind to you or unkind to you, you always regard everybody around you as an enemy. Regardless of how kind they are to you, regardless of how sweet and nice they are to you, you always think of others as your enemy. And this is something that then is being, of course, projected on the national scale, because the Soviet state's understanding now, of course, because it's being run by somebody who's a paranoid, the state's understanding also is all the time thinking of enemies inside and outside, just like this individual himself kept on thinking of his own enemies inside and outside all the time because of his case of clinical paranoia. Let's see what his own daughter is saying about this. She says, if he cast out of his heart someone who had been known to him for a long time, and if in his soul he had already translated that person into the ranks of enemies, it was impossible to hold a conversation with him about that person. That was the kind of complete disappearance that person took from Stalin's conscience, and therefore it was very easy for him to then send such a person into the gallows of death. And that's exactly what he does with friends like Nikolai Bukharin, who, by the way, had worked with him for the longest time as a part of the revolution. They had been exiled. Stalin and Bukharin had been exiled together to Serbia. And one of the last documents that was found in Stalin's bedside, the table, the desk on his bedside, was this last note by Stalin which said, "Why are you doing this to me, Koba?" Koba was Stalin's name during his revolutionary days. It's a name that he's taken after one of the folk heroes of Georgian tales and Georgian stories, and that's the name he adopted. And Bukharin, of course, called him not Stalin or not Zhugashvili, but he called him Koba. So he just sent this one last letter called, "Why are you doing this to me, Koba?" And Stalin kept it till the day he died. So this kind of attitude, it's clearly a clinical condition which Stalin is not only himself suffering from, but also ensuring that his whole country is paying for that medical disorder. So this clearly then brings us to the understanding that how did then he try to control everybody who was opposing him. Clearly his friends were opposing him. He was ready to throw them out of his heart and his soul. Clearly there were others such as Rutin who were opposing him as late as 1932. So Stalin clearly now has to think of during the 1930s, he has to think of methods by which he can put down his authoritarian control to the fullest possible extent, with absolutely no questions asked and with absolutely no justifications given. So in the years 1933 and 34, as an accompaniment to the purges, so the cleansing of the people, taking away of their party status or just getting them rid of their party status so that they have to suffer in the Soviet state, Stalin now centralized the major law enforcement agencies, the civilian police, the labor camp commandments and the guards, and all of these were now put under NKVD, which is the new version. So there was Cheka, there was OGPU, and now there's the NKVD, which is the secret police, plus a couple of more organizations, which is the civilian police, the labor camp, etc., and border and security guards. Now, if you look here, there's this new concept called the labor camp. Let's look at it. Prisons and detention centers in which the inmates were in fact required to do heavy work as well. So public works were done at no cost to the public exchequer. That is called labor camp. And NKVD, we already know this, it's the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs, or the Soviet secret police, which is directly coming after the OGPU, which in fact directly came after the Cheka, which was the first secret police as established under Lenin. And the NKVD was a body that was directly answerable to Joseph Stalin himself. So he kept the direct control of this body. We will see how characters of this particular organization also come under direct threat of Stalin, and in fact are themselves purged at a stage later on. So what happens to the Soviet Union in this context of 1934 and 36? The most famous of these is the Kirov Purge and the Post-Kirov Purges. Kirov himself was not purged. Let's see what happens to Kirov. In Leningrad, on 1st December 1934, Kirov, the secretary of the Leningrad Soviet, was shot and killed in his own office. So 34 is a time by which Stalin is very much absolutely in power. So there's no way that such a death would have happened without his acceptance. And Kirov is somebody who absolutely adores Stalin. There is no question that he is going to take a a step away from Stalin or Stalinist ideology. However, by 1934, there were already talks in the circle that Stalin is getting too old for his position. He's already 50, 55, I think, by this time. And they are thinking of Kirov as the current successor, or as the proposed successor of Joseph Stalin. And that is something that Stalin is unable to digest. And therefore, very mysteriously, in his own office, one of the top officers of the Leningrad Soviet, he is killed. Just like Hitler uses the Reichstag fire, like that is the burning of the everything that he hates, the burning of that is used, in fact, to give extraordinary powers to Adolf Hitler, something that we'll be looking at in great detail in the next case study. Similarly, Stalin uses the murder of Kirov, somebody who was becoming a challenge to him. He uses his murder to take over complete and absolute powers to take care of and to completely submit and to completely decimate and to completely destroy all opposition against him. Let's see how he does that. It is possible Stalin was implicated. What is certain is that the murder worked directly to his advantage. Kirov had been a highly popular figure in the party and, in fact, had been elected to the Politburo as well as a very young member. He was known to be unhappy with the speed of Stalin's industrialization drive and also with the growing number of purges. If organized opposition to Stalin were to form within the party, Kirov was the most likely individual around whom dissatisfied members might have rallied, even though Kirov himself is not making any of this opposition publicly known. Publicly, he is standing well within line, like quite unlike the earlier officers such as Zinoviev, Kamenev, Trotsky, Bukharin, etc., who publicly expressed their opinions, or even Yutin as late as 1932, who publicly expressed their opinions against Stalin. Kirov is doing no such thing. Kirov is very happy being under the shadows of the great father figure, Stalin. That danger, very clearly now, Stalin had to remove. Stalin was quick to exploit the situation. The moment the murder happened, he was very quick to take the advantage. One of the things that he is, if nothing else, he is very quick to take advantage of situations. You would remember from Lenin's funeral onwards, where he led as the chief mourner, giving away these catechisms. Similarly, here, Stalin too, again, was very quick to exploit the situation. Within 2 hours of learning of Kirov's murder, he signed a decree against terrorist act. So this was justified as a terrorist act. What had happened to Kirov, the murder of Kirov, was justified as a terrorist act. And please look at the timeline. Within 2 hours of learning of Kirov's murder, that means this kind of implication, the fact that he was implicated was perhaps not without reason, that he was ready already within 2 hours to think of a policy as a response to Kirov's murder. So instead of thinking of how we are going to mourn such a great leader who is leading the Leningrad, etc., who's the secretary of the Leningrad Soviet, etc., instead of thinking and planning all the post, like death of a great leader thing, immediately he is translating the horror of Kirov's murder into a policy in order to completely get rid of the opposition. In fact, that's his aim. On the pretext of hunting down the killers, a fresh purge of the party had now begun. Alright, in fact, it was begun, led by Hendrik Yagoda, who was the head of the NKVD. So, the new head of the NKVD, Yagoda, he was the person who led it. 3,000 suspected conspirators were rounded up and then imprisoned or executed, and tens of thousands of other people were deported from Leningrad. Stalin then filled the vacant position with his own nominees. So, almost 3,000. Party completely again changes color. I told you in one of the videos, like on a lighter note, it was very difficult to grow old in Stalin's Russia, in Stalin's Soviet Union, because you were always captured somewhere before you grew old. In 1935, Kirov's key post as party boss in Leningrad was filled by Andrei Zadnov, a dedicated Stalinist. The equivalent post in Moscow was now given to Nikita Khrushchev, another ardent Stalin supporter. In recognition of his successful courtroom bullying of oppositionists in earlier purge trials, Andrei Veshinsky was appointed state prosecutor. Stalin's fellow Georgian Lavrentiy Beria was entrusted with overseeing the state security in national minority areas. And finally, Stalin's personal secretary, Alexander Poskribevishev, was put in charge of the secretariat. So these major changes come into place immediately after Kirov's murder. As a result of these placements, there remained no significant area of Soviet bureaucracy which Stalin himself did not control. The outstanding feature of the post-Kirov purge was the status of many of its victims. Prominent among those arrested in the name of Kirov's murder and in the name of terrorist acts were earlier people who were just expelled from the party earlier, but now they could be completely gotten rid of, Kamenev and Zinoviev. Their arrest sent out a clear message. No party member, whatever their status, was in fact safe. Arbitrary arrest and summary execution became the norm, as the fate of representatives of the Party Congress of 1934 suggests. Out of the 1,996 delegates who attended the Party Congress, that means these are top officers of the party who attend the conference, as late as 1934, out of them 1108 were executed during the next 3 years itself. In addition, out of the 139 Central Committee members elected at the gathering, all but 41 of them were executed during the purges. So, except for 41, that means almost 108, 109 of them were in fact executed as a part during the purges. Historian Leonard Shapiro, in a celebrated study of the CPSU, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, described these events as Stalin's victory over the party. So, he had taken over the state first, and now he had completely changed the party to his own flavor. From this point on, the Soviet Communist Party was entirely under his control. It ceased in effect to have a separate existence. Stalin had become the party. Let us stop here, and then we will see what are the other measures that he takes, because now that the party is under him, there are multiple other factions within the government that he would want to take care of as well. And for that, and in order to control the larger Soviet state, we enter from this state of these purges, we enter into a stage called the Great Terror. Before that, we have a short period of Stalin enrollment, which is just like the Lenin enrollment earlier. And then we will look at the way he completely decimates opposition, just like within the party he does with the help of purges. He does that in the larger state of Soviet Union with the help of something called the Great Terror. What was the Great Terror? What were the kind of colossal damages to personnel and property that came as a part of it? All of that shall be explored in the next video. Really hoping to see you there. Till then, thank you so much.